I should say that this conceptual model came as a result of viewing experiments, which I did in the late 1970s. And then it was this simple model that I used to create the PK party format. And so I'm just going to quickly summarize, and if you'd switch to the next slide, I normally show this slide the last, and I thought tonight, well, heck, I'll show it first. And this is really a summary of what I'm trying to say. What I believe, and what I've tried to model, is that the physical brain is like a radar, transmitting and receiving information. Now, Julian this morning showed, as one of his many models, this concept. Normally I talk about the various cortices of the brain, doing the processing, much like a little computer, and another set of sensory input that comes from what I call the mind, which has the same set of senses as our normal physical sensory input. And one of the keys to learning how to work with this kind of phenomena is to be aware of and learn how to sense the information coming in from the external senses, I think being processed in the same computers here. And most people are unaware of when they're getting remote external information and when they're getting information from their physical body. But I can assure you, you can train yourself to the point where you can distinguish between them. For example, I have learned how to do remote viewing while driving. And I don't recommend that to people because if you happen to lose your sensory input from driving, it's too bad. But at any rate, I'm saying you can learn to do that. I will talk about this, and this is a very common concept across many different belief systems, but I've titled something I call the STU, which is supposed to stand for a space-time unit. You know, in my world, which is in the aerospace business, we have to have jargon with acronyms for everything. So this STU is where all the information is, you know, in the STU. So I think of this as another dimension which our mind goes into and can access remote places, both in space and time. And I'll talk a little more about that. But basically, remote perception or remote viewing is where you're accessing this remote information. And then PK, which is what our real purpose is here tonight, is to learn how to do that. Is it possible to focus that at all? What we'll learn later is get a mind connection to what we want to affect, and then we send a command across that channel, and locally, somehow energy is transduced into the thing you're trying to affect to accomplish the goal. And I'll talk a lot more about that. The next slide is a typical engineer's view of the brain. And I won't go through it tonight. If you want to read the details of this model, I recommend the Archaeus Volume 1, Number 1. The thing I was trying to say about bringing in this remote information from the STU, it's important in any kind of model like this that you have a complete feedback. And as you see at the other end there, when your brain processes, you store the information. So I believe memory is also stored in the STU. And I won't get into the details of why I believe that tonight, but that's an important thing, because like in remote viewing, when we send our mind out to access a remote place, if you're not really careful, sometimes memory information will get in, which is coming from the same input, when clobber the data. Only reason I chose to show this tonight is an important parameter that most people don't think about, and that is I tried to work with the signals from our normal sensory input, the signal that comes in from the remote place, and the background noise level of the brain. and I've tried to show all these little channels essentially sum up to a total processing load, and as that processing load goes up, the background noise level goes up. And so just as any normal engineering type sensory, we can think of the signal to noise ratio and essentially manage that when we're trying to maximize the remote signal. We minimize the background noise, we maximize the information coming in from remote, try to minimize the normal body input. And finally, most people don't understand what I'm talking about, but these senses basically, in my opinion, have different discrimination rates at which you process information. And the easiest way to teach people to do remote viewing is to start with the slow senses. Now, some of the high performers, they just jump right up to visual information. But when we teach people to do remote viewing, we actually try to get them to connect first by smell and hear at the remote place until long before we ask them for any visual information. The next slide, please. This is my drawing of the stew, where everything is. And what I tried to say here is simply, as in many different beliefs, the Akashic records, you got the Jungian interconnections and so on. So I'm trying to point out, this is not new from me, that if you can imagine that all this is in, both in the past and the future, is in some kind of storage system, and if you passed a plane, which I'm going to use to represent three-dimensional space, through that, this area is what we call now. And so the whole universe is what we perceive now. And I'm trying to show if an individual at, say, in your chair, you, is learning how to get their mind out and access remote information, they expand both in space and time. And I usually talk a lot about this chart, but I'm going to short circuit say the only thing I think I might have added is when I drew this line on here, this modulation I call emotional intensity history, that turns out to be, you know, it's like all visual and all sensory information is stored on every event, you know, and we're all filing it constantly, and we also file some parameter that's related to emotional intensity, and that's the parameter that we're going to utilize tonight to learn how to affect things. The next slide is my simple way of looking at, in a quantum mechanical sense, you know, if you think about Schrodinger wave functions in a macro way of collapsing what we call reality or things around us. So let's say it, you know, collapses to this table, and we sense that and we file that information. When we go back in our memory, we either see or feel or whatever in our heads, and however you do that, if you're a visual person, then you can see a past event. And that's what I've tried to show on top. An important, subtle thing is that when you look into the future, you, in my opinion, collapse a state of a Schrodinger, say, type wave function of whatever is the most, you know, probable at that time, now. And you then remember that in the same, you've filed that information, it becomes a memory. And I also happen to believe that you can change that future. So, and that's called free will. So often when you move ahead in time, there are decisions that happen. People make decisions that in effect shuffle and change this wave function so that when you get there, it's different than the so-called psychic prediction. My best example, the one I always talk about, is imagine a yellow car coming down the street. You're at this intersection, and you step off the curb, and you in your dream or however perceive that you were hit and died. 2 years later, you might be coming along, and at that intersection, you all of a sudden have this deja vu where you've been here before, you see the yellow car coming down the road, and you start to step off the curb, and there's sort of that little bit of time where you may be able to decide not to be hit and step back up in the curb, let the car go by, and in effect reshuffle all of the information that went into making up these possible future states. The reason I brought that up tonight is, I know it gets a little philosophical, but we are, and I'll talk very briefly about it, conducting an associated remote viewing experiment where we're essentially trying to manage the likelihood of the occurrence of a future event. And the only thing we don't know is the information that's associated with the correct outcome of that future event you're trying to predict the outcome of. And what we are finding is that we now have the technology to do that fairly accurately. Next slide. This is a slice through time, say at a remote place where the viewer, let's say a remote viewer was sitting here, looked out to some coordinate point on Earth and tried to access the information that was there. What I found in my experiments, what other people have found as well, is that sometimes that viewer accesses information from another time which is accurate for at that place. And so I often just simply say that I think the mind scans in time. It goes out to that remote place, it scans in time until it hits the peak emotional event, and it acts like a tuner in time. It locks onto that, and somehow information comes into our brain through that mind link I talked about, and that's how information is accessed. Now, what happens here is most of the parapsychology type experiments, you know, they don't do very well if they allow time to shift around like this, and which is a real problem. So what I think, you know, normally the mind can jump from peak to peak if you let go of that point and finally get to the point of your intention and the emotion that's been superimposed on that remote target area. And finally, if you lower this threshold far enough, we'll lock on to the current time. And the reason for all this gibberish up to this point is that when I drew this curve, or plot or whatever, the thing that hit me was that if somehow I create enough, what I called emotional intensity at the current time, then the mind would lock on to now. And so in the 1980, I went around the country giving most of the major parapsychology laboratories a briefing on my model, the remote viewing experiment results, and I said just that I thought that one could control this problem we have with time shifts and get the phenomena happening now. Everybody laughed and basically challenged me to test that idea. And so in January of 1981, almost 5 years to the date, I got together a group of people at my house and we had the first PK party, which I'll talk a little bit. I'll skip what I normally say about that till I start the official PK party. The thing about the new experiment, the associated remote viewing, is that we create a peak emotional event in the future at some point in space, a place. And by in effect controlling when and where we create that peak emotional event, the mind goes out and like a beacon locks on to the information at that time, and the remote viewers can very accurately, reasonably accurately, get enough data in order to get the correct target picture we use associated with the outcome of another event. I think the next slide, and last slide, hopefully, is the chart that I've used to explain how to do the remote viewing. And it is pretty complicated, and I'm going to just tell you that what I've tried to say was, this is time now. We control and create a peak emotional event in the future. The remote viewers lock onto that. They see the picture associated with the outcome, and I've shown the stock market here. And just to let you know, this isn't all just a bunch of hot air. We now have about 15 groups doing this all over the country, and there's been, I think, 217 actual investments into the stock market with about 65% accuracy, which turns out to be a single-tail p-value for the parapsychologists of 0.0006. So it's extremely interesting because we now have a large database already, and what we're going to do is make a lot of money to fund the research and shift the conscious, shift the money into the hands of the conscious. People that are willing and able to do these things will be able to fund their work, and this works.